How do you get a tank or armored vehicle into Ukraine? That may seem like a strange question to ask given the massive network of supporters Ukraine has in mid-2024. Dozens of countries are sending financial aid to Ukraine, often in the form of military equipment. The obvious answer would be that the equipment that Ukraine needs is being flown, driven, or even sailed into the country via any number of other supporting nations. But it wasn't always like that. During the early months of the war, Ukraine found itself scrambling to get its hands on any equipment it could find, with tanks and armored vehicles being priorities. It needed both, not only to repel the Russian invaders, but to fight them on a near equal footing as they used their own tanks to take territory. Ukraine didn't have the support of other nations during those early days, but it did have another route it could take to get the tanks it needed: private arms dealers. That brings us to the question we'll answer in this video. How did private arms dealers help Ukraine to fight back during the early days of the war? To begin answering the question, we'll introduce you to UK-based businessman Nick Mead. Aged 61, Mead has always been a military enthusiast, which is likely why he set up his business, Tanks a Lot. The business had a fairly benign purpose. Mead would buy old tanks to give them the once-over before making them available to anybody who wanted them. His customers often included the producers of movies and TV shows, who would rent his tanks for use in their productions before returning them. Mead also made the tanks available for experience days. He would rent them out to venues or host special events at his farm in Northamptonshire. Mead had been running the business for around 2 decades, and he developed quite the reputation. Some even consider him to be the best in the UK, at least those operating in the private sector, when it comes to tank engineering. Then the Ukraine war began. And suddenly, Mead saw an entirely new business avenue open up, selling his collection of tanks to Ukrainian buyers. It was all legal. Working alongside the UK's Department of Trade and Industry, Mead began refurbishing and selling his tanks to Ukraine, bullet and bomb-proofing dozens of the vehicles before sending them off to the front lines of the war. It was a profitable venture for Mead, as 2022 saw his business turn over an astonishing £8 million, around $10.2 million, thanks to the sales. All of this raises some interesting questions, not least of which was how was all of this legal? We've established that Mead was able to work within official channels to sell his tanks, but it's the question of how he built up such an impressive collection that will confuse many viewers. First of all, it's legal for anybody to buy a tank in the United Kingdom, as long as they meet a handful of conditions, according to Key Military. The vehicle must be properly licensed with the country's Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, or DVLA, just as a regular car would be. The prospective tank owner also needs to prove that they have an H license, or that they're being supervised by somebody with such a license, and will equip the tank with L plates to signify that they're a learner driver before they take it out on the road. An H license covers any vehicle that has tracks instead of tires, which can include bulldozers, snowmobiles, and excavators in addition to tanks. You likely noticed the mention that it's legal for somebody with an H license to drive a tank on the road. That's absolutely the case in the UK, though conditions apply again. For one, the tank must be equipped with special rubber pads or rubber tracks, allowing it to be driven on roads while minimizing the risk that it will cause damage to public highways. There are also conditions placed on the tank's width and weight. It can be no more than 9.5 feet wide, with its weight amounting to no more than 48.5 tons. Then there's the armament issue. Though the UK appears surprisingly liberal when it comes to tank ownership and driving, it has strict rules for firearms ownership. Without a license, you can't own a live-firing gun, with that rule applying just as much to the cannon of a tank as it does to regular small arms. Museums often get exemption to these rules, but a private collector like Mead would likely hone in on tanks that have either been deactivated or have reproduction cannons that can't actually be fired. Many buyers choose to have the Birmingham Proof House conduct an on-site visit to confirm the tank's cannon is neutralized, assuming it doesn't come with certification saying as much. The point here is that it's legal for somebody in the UK to own a tank. In Mead's case, a pathway to selling them to Ukraine was opened up by the country's Department of Trade and Industry. That leads us to another question. Who's buying tanks from private sellers? One of the answers to that question comes from a Channel 4 report published on YouTube in 2023 that took a closer look at Mead and the steps he took to sell his tanks to Ukraine. The report notes that Mead experienced a few instances in which his tanks ended up in the hands of other buyers and resellers, one of whom bought several only to store them on his farm so he could sell them at a later date when Ukraine would be willing to buy them at an even higher price. Mead wasn't comfortable with that, both for the profiteering aspect and because he believed his tanks needed to get to Ukraine as quickly as possible. As he points out in the video, they need it now, not in 3 months. Accordingly, he adjusted his strategy so he would only sell to trusted buyers. One of those buyers is a man named Slav. A Ukrainian national who's lived in the UK for around 20 years, Slav is something of an intermediary between sellers like Mead and the Ukrainians who need access to his tanks. He set up shop on the day that Russia invaded his home country, facilitating the transfer of 2 Land Rover vehicles as soon as he heard about the invasion. In that case, he drove the vehicles to Ukraine himself, showing that there was a clear route through to the country for private sellers. Their vehicles can simply be driven in because practically all of the European countries to the west of Ukraine support it in its war effort. Like Mead, Slav started working through more official channels following that initial transfer of Land Rovers to Ukraine. Specifically, he's become an intermediary for the Ukraine World Congress, which is a non-governmental organization, or NGO, that raises money from ordinary people to fund the purchase and facilitate the arrival of military equipment into Ukraine. That allowed Slav to scale up his production, in addition to giving Mead a buyer who would purchase from him in bulk. The sale of 25 of Mead's armored personnel carriers, or APCs, is a good example. Slav helped them to get from Mead to where they needed to go with the NGO's help. Interestingly, there's even an element of branding in play, making Mead's budding arms business akin to a regular consumer-facing company. In the case of the APCs, each was stamped with a special logo created by Slav to demonstrate where they came from, as well as being given the paperwork they needed to be transported via road across Europe to reach Ukraine. From there, the vehicles Mead sells begin a 2,000-mile journey from his farm to the Ukrainian front lines. Slav is far from the only intermediary of this nature in the UK. According to Channel 4, another is Serhiy Prytula. He runs a charity in the country that buys equipment from private sellers to send over to Ukraine's forces. He's also a former politician and TV star in Ukraine, with the Channel 4 report claiming that he was responsible for mediating the purchase of 100 APCs from 5 different suppliers in the UK in 2023. People like Slav and Serhiy proved vital during the early days of the war in Ukraine, when the country was scrambling to get its hands on any equipment it could to fend off Russia. But even now that billions of dollars of military aid are pouring into Ukraine, these private sellers and their intermediaries aren't going out of business. In fact, Channel 4 notes that Serhiy is still calling for donations and that he has vehicles his charity has purchased waiting to be transported into Ukraine. In other words, selling weapons and military equipment isn't a cottage industry focused solely on Nick Mead. Just as there are several intermediaries and groups facilitating the sale of equipment to Ukraine, so too are there many private citizens and small businesses that are more than happy to sell. In the wake of Mead's success, several other enterprising arms dealers have made a pretty penny from selling to Ukraine. For instance, an August 2023 report published by The Guardian discussed the actions of Freddie Verslice, who's the CEO of a defense company named OIP Land Systems. Verslice claims to have purchased 49 old Leopard 1 tanks that used to belong to Belgium, only to sell them off to an unnamed European country so they could be transported into Ukraine. Verslice was cagey about the details. He wouldn't name the country that was serving as the intermediary in the transaction, nor would he tell The Guardian how much he sold the tanks for. However, the newspaper was able to establish that he paid around €37,000, approximately $40,270 per tank, with another of the paper's sources suggesting that the tanks were purchased from Verslice by a major German defense player. That led to speculation that the buyer was a company named Rheinmetall, a German arms maker, which apparently planned to prepare them for export into Ukraine. Germany's defense ministry declined to comment on the transaction. This wasn't the first time that Verslice found himself embroiled in tank-selling controversy. About 7 months before he finally achieved his sale, he found himself in a publicized battle with Belgium's defense minister, Ludovine de Donda, over his intentions to send his old Leopard tanks to Ukraine. That conflict gave some insight into the prices Verslice may have been asking for his tanks. It's an interesting situation. When various nations came together and pledged to send tanks to Ukraine, Belgium wasn't part of that group, specifically because it had sold the last of its tanks, the 50 Leopards, to Verslice. When the war in Ukraine began, Belgium's government got in touch with Verslice with the apparent intention to buy its old tanks back so it could send them to Ukraine. The problem was that Verslice wanted a far higher price to sell the tanks than the price he'd paid to purchase them. How much higher? De Donda claimed that the tanks sold to Verslice for as little as $10,800 were being offered back to Belgium for a staggering $540,000 each. That was despite those tanks not even being operational, meaning Belgium would have to invest even more money to get them up and running again. For the record, Verslice went public to argue against de Donda's assertions. He claims that he bought the batch of 50 tanks for about $2.17 million, bringing the per-tank price closer in line to the $40,000 mark mentioned by The Guardian, and that the sale price he was quoting in February could be anywhere between a few $100,000 and $1 million. He also disputed de Donda's claims that he'd be selling tanks that don't work. Verslice claims that any price he quoted would include the cost of refitting the tanks to make them operational again. He even gave prices for that. Replacing asbestos in a tank engine, for instance, could cost around $80,000, whereas replacing the system that controls the tank's gunfire would set him back around $380,000. If those figures are accurate, he'd be justified in charging as much as he is to sell those tanks back to Belgium, or indeed, to sell them to an unnamed country so they could be sent to Ukraine, as he has to invest heavily into them. If nothing else, Verslius takes offense at what people are saying about him. Specifically, he doesn't want anybody calling him an arms dealer. He's just a guy who buys old things people don't need so he can fix them up and sell them on. Still, this controversy brings us to another question about people like Verslius and Mead. Are they profiteering from the war in Ukraine? It depends who you ask. Mead argues that his only goal is to make sure that Ukraine has access to the tanks and APCs that it needs, making him altruistic at a time when many nations were hemming and hawing over sending aid to Ukraine. But we also can't ignore that Mead made around $10 million from the sale of 100 tanks, a per-tank revenue of $100,000. Some may argue that the truly altruistic would simply donate the tanks rather than selling them at such a high price. Verslius seems less interested in painting himself as an altruist, instead digging into specifics about how much it costs him to even get his tanks into a sellable condition. Who could bemoan him for making a small profit after putting in the work that Belgium refused to do? After all, wasn't it Belgium that sold the tanks to him in the first place? Why should it then be able to turn around and criticize him for not selling them back just because the country got rid of the last of its stock before the war in Ukraine erupted? Mead himself has some misgivings over selling his tanks. Speaking in the previously mentioned Channel 4 video, he said that the high demand for his product created soaring prices, noting that there are some who believe he's profiteering from the war. His response? I guess we are, and that kind of hurts. What I'm trying to do is help Ukraine. Still, he recognizes that some private arms dealers are exploiting the situation to make more money, which leads right back into the profiteering conversation. How extensive is it? The Kyiv Independent offered some insight in a report published in June 2023. Its report notes the terrible situation Kyiv found itself in at the beginning of the war. Desperate for any weapons it could get its hands on, Ukraine found itself buying at almost any cost, which drew an immediate response from European private arms dealers. The price of services went up, with the news outlet reporting that one broker in these deals started asking between 3 and 6 times the market average for their weapons. This display of supply and demand economics created an unexpected issue. When Ukraine's allies finally started to dedicate money to the country's cause, many found themselves having to spend more than they expected to buy arms from these private dealers. The situation between Belgium and Verslius, discussed earlier, is a perfect example. Belgium found its spending power decreasing due to the higher prices being charged for tanks it had only sold a short time before. This led to it deciding not to buy, assuming it wasn't the unnamed European country that eventually purchased the tanks in August. The knock-on effect here is that the countries supplying Ukraine that aren't pulling directly from their own stocks are having to spend more on weapons than they did in the past. In the end, Ukraine gets less. Then there's the issue of broker commissions. The report cites one instance in which the price of a specific type of ammo rose by around a third in March 2022. That rise came as the supposed result of private sellers setting up a supply chain of intermediaries, with the ammunition traveling through the Netherlands, Estonia, and finally the Czech Republic before it reached Ukraine. The Kyiv International even traced the final link in that chain, naming it as a Czech company called Excalibur International. But here's the most interesting part. The outlet notes that one broker received $2.175 million commission as part of the deal. That commission amounted to about 30% of the total sale price. The implication is clear. The approximate 30% increase in the price of this ammunition wasn't for setting up a supply chain. Almost all of it appears to have been pocketed by a broker commanding a commission that's roughly equal to the price increase, a commission that industry insiders say is abnormally high. The point is that Ukraine's relationship with private arms dealers stretch far further than an enterprising businessman in the UK selling his old tanks. There's an entire industry here, one that's taking advantage of supply and demand economics while limiting the impact that Ukraine's allies can have by charging them much more for the equipment they want to send over than they would have paid for before the war. The Kyiv Independent is far from the only outlet reporting on private sellers, or even private citizens, bolstering their bank accounts thanks to the Ukraine war. In March 2022, about a month after the war started, Open Democracy noted that at least 5 members of the UK's House of Lords made a tidy profit from the war. Each has investments placed in a company called BAE Systems, believed to be at least $14,700 each, with each benefiting from BAE's share price rocketing up by 23% in the 4 weeks after the war began. Those investors were far from the only ones who saw huge profits in a short period due to the war. The same outlet reports that investors in the German company Rheinmetall saw their share prices increase by 60%, whereas those holding shares in Leonardo, an Italian firm, reaped the rewards of a 44% increase. The Ukraine war has proven profitable for many people, it seems, and the further you move up the chain, the stronger those profits become. In June 2022, Sky News reported on the profits some American companies were raking in thanks to the early months of the war. For instance, Washington's promise of 6,500 Javelin anti-tank systems, made by both Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, would set the US back $100,000 per launcher. Even if the launchers came from pre-existing American stock, that would still need to be replenished, meaning the two companies get a bumper $650 million deal out of the promise. And that's before you consider that each missile the launcher uses costs $78,000. The Ukraine war could easily mean $1 billion or more in revenue for those two companies from that single weapon. Raytheon received another boost with America's decision to send 1,400 Stinger missile systems to Ukraine in June 2022. Those came out of the US reserves, with Raytheon receiving a $625 million contract to replenish the depleted stocks in the aftermath. No matter where you look, there's profit to be made. The previously mentioned BAE Systems locked down a contract to replace 400,000 UK rounds sent to Ukraine, as well as replacing the 108 155mm howitzers the US sent and the Milan anti-tank missile systems offered by France. Is it any wonder that defense companies' shares skyrocketed in the early days of the war? Still, perhaps things calmed down a little once the supplies were sent and the war was a year or so deep. Not at all. In September 2023, Declassified UK reported on arms dealers toasting extremely high profits during the Defence and Security Equipment International event. Often touted as the world's largest event for arms dealers, it was filled with defence companies making a lot of money. As Matthew Bragoni, who represented Ensign Bickford Aerospace and Defence at the event, put it, "Everyone's well aware that the US military has been donating a lot of product that was in stock. The result? We're seeing the second-order effect where these purchases, as the US emptied out their inventory, they're rebuying." Perhaps Mead's misgivings about profiteering were right on the money. Though nations are giving weapons to Ukraine, those weapons aren't materializing thanks to acts of charity. Manufacturers are raking in bumper profits as they're asked to develop more, with private sellers like Mead and Verslice able to snatch up a small piece of the pie for themselves merely thanks to the fact that they own stock that's currently in high demand. Let's come back to the man who started the video, Nick Mead. After making $10 million in sales from his tanks, you'd have to assume that he's sitting pretty with his windfall, but that's not the case. Despite Mead claiming that all he wanted to do was help Ukraine in its hour of need, he's experienced some pretty nasty consequences from his newfound career as an arms dealer. The least of these is having his bank account shut down. A customer of the UK's Barclays Bank for over 40 years, Mead could do little more than sit back and watch as the bank shut down his savings, business and online accounts. The situation became so bad for Mead that he was on the verge of declaring bankruptcy as he lost access to his millions. He even considered moving to Singapore. At least there he could open a new account and continue selling his tanks. "I've sent 100 vehicles to Ukraine in the last year, including tanks with guns, but a bank is driving me out of business," Mead claimed in a 2023 article published in Metro. He also decried the slow reactions of the politicians in the UK, saying he couldn't help but laugh when he saw them collectively applaud themselves for sending 14 Challenger tanks when he'd sent over 100 of his own tanks at that point. But it gets worse for Mead. Barclays shutting down his accounts with no explanation was damaging enough, but he believes he's made himself a target for Russia with his actions. "I've been told that I'm on a Russian hit list for the work I'm doing, and I'm prepared to accept the risk to help Ukraine defend itself," he claims before once again decrying the banks for caring more about the risk his business presents to their balance sheets than the risk he's taking on himself. Perhaps there's some validity to saying that no good deed goes unpunished. Thankfully, there are no reports of a Russian hit squad having successfully taken Mead out of the game yet, and he's far from the only private seller who's providing weaponry to Ukraine. He's simply become one of the figureheads, an example that proves that there are many roads to follow when sending weapons to Ukraine and, to the more cynical among you, many ways to turn a profit from the devastation the war has wrought. But what do you think about Mead and his story? Were his intentions as pure as he made them out to be, or was he simply one of the first of many private sellers and companies to take advantage of a lucky windfall that happened to blow in his direction? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why this thing is a nightmare for Russian soldiers, or click this other video instead.